a London-based global specialist risk consultancy firm known as Control Risks. And the Oxford Economics Africa recently released the 9th edition of the Africa Risk Reward Index. The report was released at a time when Africa is experiencing a significant generational shift in politics, increased continental connectivity, and rapid emergence of transformative technologies. So, what should policymakers, business leaders, and investors make of the risks that the continent presents, as well as the rewards? Welcome my guest, Bongo Adi, a professor of economics at the Lagos Business School, to the show. We thank you much for connecting in tonight, Professor Adi.
Thank you very much, Boyson. Thank you for having me.
It's great. We're having you here with the show tonight. Do you agree that generational politics tainted with unrest and protests have become a key factor for Africa?
Yes, I have. I mean, there is what economists call the demographic dividend, or the demographic shift. I think that is about happening in Africa. I was just listening earlier to the Berlin Global Dialogue, where the president of France was speaking about European affairs and the challenge, the current global, dispensation poses for Europe as a continent. And then they are trying to look at the strategies that will help them to remain competitive. So I think in Africa, we are also facing similar things. I mean, we cannot hide from those challenges any longer. Our young people, have woken up to expect more from what the government is offering all over Africa. And until those critical issues are addressed, I think we'll continue to see more of that. Yes, you talk about transformational technologies in Africa, you talk about interconnectivity, but the question remains whether Africa is doing enough. Because if you look at it, Africa contributes more than 30% of global mineral reserves. In fact, oil production alone, Africa has about 8% of the world's crude reserve. But then what do we get out of this? I don't think it is commensurate with what Africa is exporting to the rest of the world, which is an index of global development. And if you listen to Macron today, what he was talking about was essentially what Europe could give to the rest of the world, because to them, China poses serious risk and challenge that has converted Europe into merely consumers more than they are producers. And I think the same can be said of Africa. So there are a lot of things, a lot of grounds to cover if we are going to settle the demands of the youthful population, who can no longer, be really kept at peace, given that they know what is going on in the rest of the world, and they know what the future really portends for them.
So when you look at politics in Africa over the last 1 year, for example, the elections in South Africa, for example, the government of national unity and how that country is moving on, the currency is recovering, interest rates been taken lower, inflation is also trending lower. You look at the elections last December in Egypt, you look at the elections in Kenya and what's been coming out of the finance law brouhaha under President William Ruto, and elsewhere in Liberia next door, in Senegal, in other places. Do you think these trends are beginning to shape up politics and how investment flows for economic development across the continent? Do you think international, multilateral, bilateral agencies are beginning to reward economies that have some form of peaceful political transitions in terms of the reward for investment?
Yeah, so I mean, politics is one thing, and I think politics is key. It's not just one thing, actually. I think I was wrong there. Politics is key, and in Africa, for a long time, I wouldn't say that we've gotten our politics right. Again, I like to refer to the earlier dialogue happening in Berlin, listening to the young Macron, his articulation, how he understands the challenges that Europe as a continent is facing. So I was thinking about Africa. How many of the politicians that we have can really articulate African reality from that global perspective and able to give it to the right impetus that it deserves? So I understand, in Senegal, we have a young man who has just been elected as the president while in a peaceful transition to power. If you go to South Africa, yes, you talk about their rebounding economy and all of that. Yes, 11 of the fastest growing economies today globally are all in Africa. But it's one thing to grow the GDP, but it's also another thing really to become competitive in the global scheme of things, because I think that is what will improve standard of living. One of the principles of economics says that a country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. What you didn't mention is that many multinationals have been leaving the African market in recent times. Whether it's in South Africa, you mentioned it, or in Kenya, or even in Nigeria. We've seen most of them going, despite the fact that we're having this growth. So you could see also the unrest that we witnessed earlier in Kenya was because of some people, linked it to joblessness, jobless growth. Same thing in South Africa, and most times, South Africa is not immune to their, ultra-nationalistic bent, which again they link to joblessness. We've seen that also manifesting in Nigeria. Regardless of what the government does to try to quell that. But we know the state of affairs here, especially with respect to our youth. It's a good thing that the president has mentioned in his yesterday's speech that there's going to be a 30-day youth conference. I guess that is also addressing that matter. So if you begin to look at how the youth have started to engage with the system, one thing that comes out is their dissatisfaction with the speed of growth. Even though the economy may be growing, but from the way many of the African population, the youthful population, because that's the advantage that Africa has today, the way they are responding to it does not suggest that the growth is strong enough or robust enough to take care of their anxieties for the future. And from the way I look at it also, I just mentioned about competitiveness. Yes, we've been talking about African Continental Free Trade Agreement and all of that. But the fact remains that Africa has not managed to really improve intracontinental trading. Much of what happens among African countries occurs at the informal level. So at such level of informality, there is little or no, very limited data regarding the volume of transactions happening, between African countries. Because, just as the Europeans are worried over the way China has taken over, whether it is production, manufacturing, or agriculture, or the new technology, emerging new technologies. So everybody's worried of what is going on in China, because eventually every other place is going to be a dumping ground for Chinese manufactured products, meaning that we are not able to really compete. Yes. So those are some of the critical issues I think that we should be addressing our minds and thoughts to. Yeah,
this report, Professor Hardy, says that Africa is at an inflection point, and you just touched on a bit on youth unemployment. If you look at the numbers in South Africa, majority of that figure, 36%, majority of them are blacks, South Africans. So you talk about tax to GDP ratio, revenue, debt, and so on. How important are these risk parameters for the government that they need to pay very important and very quick attention in terms of governance and try to stem protests and unrest that are coming mostly from the youthful population, which is a demographic dividend, if that is not liability, if care is not taken?
I mean, there is no other escape except that investment has to really be prioritized. So investment, not just in human capital accumulation. So you can invest in human capital formation, train more people, get more people with graduate degrees. But the most important thing is for them to have means of livelihood. So how do we grow the economy? I think that's the real challenge that African countries in general is facing today. Now, how can we ensure a full employment sort of growth in Africa? That is what other countries are concerned with. Whatever policies they're making, whether it's at the fiscal level, you mentioned taxation and all of that, or the macroeconomic level, everything is geared toward growing the economy in such a way that the livelihood of people, especially the young people, is guaranteed. So what do we need to do in Africa? What do the politicians, the leaders need to do? So one thing, there is a huge opportunity in Africa. Everybody knows that. But one thing we cannot do today is to begin to compete with China, for instance, in so many things. But we can trade among ourselves. There was a study by I think UNDP some years ago that identified so many value chains, about 75 or so of them, that could be fully domesticated in Africa, whether it is in automobile manufacturing, in agriculture, in pharmaceutical industries, and so on. Many value chains could be fully domesticated in Africa. What it means is that part of the chain could start from one African country, continue in another, and then exported to another country. So so the round tripping could happen within our continental borders without going through Europe or going through China. But we haven't seen that conversation happening at a larger scale. I heard you earlier talking about AFDB, Adewumi Adesina. So yes, at their own level, they have done a little bit of that, trying to promote intra-Africa trade. But I think that is where our government, whether in Nigeria or South Africa or Kenya, needs to really pay very serious attention to. How do we improve trading with Africa? Because there's a huge potential that need to be tapped, and unless we tap it, it's not possible to convert what you refer to as that demographic dividend into real opportunities. Otherwise, we run the risk of having that dividend become a liability. I mean, at certain level, I think development can no longer be discussed or planned as just within national frontiers, national borders. We need to look across borders. What can we give to other countries? What can we get from them, especially within the African? So how do we promote intra-African trade? That is the conversation that not happening at the dimension and depth that it needs to, that it should take.
Professor Adi, one of the conversations been going on in the world is technology, and that is making very serious inroads across the continent. But the report says that Africa won't make good progress unless we fix the basics, such as electricity. Do you agree?
That's basic. So the challenge we still face in Africa is that of infrastructure. So the deficit is mounting each year. So with the increasing number of people, and so also we have the deficit expanding each passing day. So so it's one thing to talk about those deficits, but it's another thing to raise the investment to address those deficits. How would that happen? Last year, I remember earlier in the year, late last year. So there was this. I think you were there. The IMF. Presentation at the Lagos Business School. We showed that the African countries run the risk of not having to inability to raise sufficient financing for this much needed infrastructure investment. And currently, African countries are also swimming under a huge burden of debt. I don't want to talk about the Chinese weaponization of finance that Africans have fallen victim to, so many African countries. So these are all very big problems, challenges that will undermine the efforts at investing in infrastructure. But of course, like you said, We cannot make progress with technology or industrialization if we don't fix infrastructure. But to fix infrastructure, we need the financing. But correct. Beyond financing, we need also the enabling environment. In some countries, financing may not be a problem, but what's the biggest challenge is having the right framework that would deliver on such infrastructure assets. I think Nigeria comes, comes as a good example of that. It's not about finance alone. It's about the integrity of government and the ability to respect, the sanctity of contracts.
Very, very interesting. Thank you so much for those deep dive analysis into the latest Africa Risk Reward Index report for 2024. Have a great evening, Professor Bongo Adi of the Lagos Business School. Thank you so much. We appreciate that.